Welcome to my madness, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I want to talk about whether or not the action figures that we love to collect are actually worth the price we pay. And this is a question that has been going around a lot in the last couple of years, as we've seen a lot of prices rise quite dramatically. Hasbro, Mattel, McFarlane, everybody's been raising their prices at some point over the last couple of years. We've seen prices on 6-inch figures go from an average of $20 to $25. 3 3/4-inch figures or 4-inch figures have gone from an average of $10 to $15. So there's been some significant rise in prices, and some people are asking, is it even worth it anymore to keep collecting? And it's a good question, especially with the economy being what it is today. Is it worth it to collect? So what I want to do today is take what limited knowledge I have and have gathered of, the cost of producing action figures in the 1980s versus today, and kind of pass some of that along. Now, I'm in no way an expert. I've never worked for a toy company or anything like that, but I have done some research to kind of try and at least get the information for myself to know whether or not I'm overpaying for something. And I'd like to pass along some of that information to you. Now, real quick shout out to a channel on YouTube, Spectre Creative, who I watch all the time. He has a lot more knowledge on this stuff than I do, to be honest with you. So I definitely recommend you go check him out. And I'd be very curious to see if he has ever done a video exactly like this before. I'm not sure if he has, but I might have to check that out and just see. But so I want to talk about the cost difference and whether or not today it's worth buying these figures at $25 on average for a 6-inch scale figure. Is it worth it for that price when you go back 15 years and we were paying roughly $10 a piece for Toy Biz Marvel Legends or whatever it was at the time? Prices have gone up quite a bit, right? $25 for a figure like this. If you look at some of the new stuff McFarlane's coming out with, $30. They're doing $29.95 now on a lot of their stuff, their newer stuff that's coming out. Is it worth these prices? When you look back to the 1980s and you look at a lot of the figures that were coming out, obviously the two biggest lines I feel in the 1980s were G.I. Joe and Star Wars. So figures like this Storm Shadow here. This is an original 1980s version 1 Storm Shadow. Love this figure. Storm Shadow is my favorite G.I. Joe. And depending on when you bought this, when you bought a G.I. Joe action figure between like 1983 and 1987, you were paying anywhere from $2 to $4 for a 3 3/4-inch figure. Right? That goes for Star Wars as well. So $2 to $4 versus $25 today. Now, obviously, there's a lot of differences between then and now in the value of a dollar. Obviously, inflation plays a huge role, as well as changes in manufacturing and tooling and molding and all kinds of other things. And a lot of these things I don't have any knowledge of. So I'm just going to go off of the things that I do have some knowledge of. For instance, differences in plastic. You take a figure like this. Now, if you compare this to Star Wars of the same time, they were two very differently manufactured figures. G.I. Joe went primarily with ABS plastic because at the time ABS was cheaper than PVC, which of course Star Wars used more PVC parts in their figures. And the reason was pretty simple because, well, at the time Star Wars was a 5 POA figure. It had less parts. It was only 6 pieces to put a Star Wars figure together on average, and that's if it had a separate head. A lot of the Alien figures that Star Wars came out with actually had the head as a piece of the torso, so that was actually only 5 pieces to put an action figure together, whereas with G.I. Joe, because of the articulation, there were more pieces, usually up to 11 pieces to put one of these together. So Hasbro used a cheaper type of plastic because ABS was cheaper back in the 1980s than PVC was. Today, it's quite different, actually. Today, PVC is actually cheaper than ABS, not by a lot, but by enough. When you're producing these in mass, it does start to make a difference, which is one reason why today we see figures like this Storm Shadow, G.I. Joe Classifieds, made with mostly PVC. There is some ABS on just about every figure today, including this one, the upper torso here, but by and large, the majority of this figure is made out of PVC. Now, that doesn't really play into the price difference between today and back in the 1980s, but it is just kind of a little information to where you can see that manufacturing has changed since the 1980s and prices have changed since the 1980s. And it's not just all about inflation. There are other factors as well. For instance, today, ABS costs about $1.50 a pound, whereas PVC costs about $1 a pound. So about 50% more for ABS than for PVC. You start to see why they choose different materials when putting a lot of these figures together, and why when you see maybe retro figures like this come out, they tend to be a little higher priced because, well, it costs a little more today than it used to just based on the cost of the materials. Now, another thing I want to talk about is going to be molding and tooling and things like that. Molding is very expensive. For instance, on a figure like this back in the day with 11 pieces, that was 11 different molds that Hasbro had to buy to produce this figure, because there's 11 different pieces on it that have to be assembled to put this figure together. And each one of those molds can cost anywhere from $20,000 to $100,000 for one mold. And that's if they only buy one mold per each piece of this figure, right? And that goes with PVC, ABS, anything across the board. Then you look at Star Wars, obviously they didn't have to have as many molds for their figures because less pieces. As opposed to today, where an action figure in 6-inch scale, which is the industry standard now, can have anywhere from 22 to 28 separate pieces, each requiring its own mold at $20,000 to $100,000 per mold. Okay? You can be talking about, if it's all new and no reuse, you can be talking about over $1 million worth of molds just for one figure. That gets pretty expensive. And again, that's only if they just want to do one mold per piece and they don't plan to make these in such high bulk that they're going to need multiple molds for one figure. So it makes a big difference. And then, of course, the other big difference is just going to be the sheer size difference between what was the standard back in the 80s, 3 3/4 inch, and what is the standard today, which is 6-inch scale, or sometimes, in McFarlane's case and other manufacturers, even bigger than that. It just means more plastic. In fact, pound for pound, this thing has about 4 times as much plastic as this figure does right here, and that makes a big difference when it comes to cost. And so there's a lot of factors that go into this, but let's talk about money, right? Let's talk about what the dollar was worth back in the 1980s versus today. So if you were to take the buying power with inflation all factored in of what $25 worth of buying power gives you today versus in the 1980s, you're talking about roughly $8 back in the mid 1980s, right? Well, if we were paying anywhere from $2 to $4 for a figure in the mid 1980s, and $8 is $25 worth of buying power today, that's a big jump, right? Like, that's anywhere from 2 to 3 times as much money as what we were actually paying for a figure. But again, when you start to factor in engineering, size, materials, molds, you start to see why that price goes up. You start to see why the equivalent of basically $13, maybe $12 today for a figure like this compared to what we paid for it in the 1980s, because of what money is worth today, why a figure like this that is turned into this is $25. Sure, if we were to take 1980 dollars and transfer them into today, this figure would cost you somewhere between $8 to $13 for a 3 3/4 inch figure with 11 molds that were required to put it together. It's not bad, really. $8 to $13. And in fact, if you look at the cost, look at the price, the retail price for things like the Star Wars Vintage Collection, I mean, those figures on average go for about $15, which is more than inflation, but you also have to realize those figures also are 4-inch versus 3 3/4, so a little bit bigger, a little more plastic, and a lot more articulation than a figure like this. Okay, so that's more molds, more time, more money invested into putting out a 3 3/4 or 4-inch figure. Now I have to break in real quick with this edit point because I actually finished this video without making this one very important part about toys, specifically action figures manufactured in the 1980s. And that was back in the 1980s. You have to remember that toy lines, Star Wars, G.I. Joe, Ninja Turtles, all these things, sometimes some of these figures were made and sold as lost leader items. And what that means is they actually lost money on these, but they did so because it helped them sell other products. And you have to remember the other products where these companies made the most money, where they made the bulk of what they made on any particular line, was through vehicles. So a lot of times they would sell these figures even cheaper by standards that we go by today, because they knew if you bought the figures you would then want to buy the vehicles that went with these figures. So they were willing to take less money for the figures themselves in exchange for the fact that you'd spend more money on the actual vehicles where they made a higher profit margin, which is just something that in today's modern collecting, especially with 6-inch collectibles, is just not a thing. Hasbro and Mattel and McFarlane are not manufacturing action figures to get you to buy vehicles, by and large, because they don't really make vehicles anymore, so they have to make all their profit on the actual figures themselves. And that is definitely an important thing to factor in when adjusting for cost and inflation from the 1980s to today. Okay, so when you look at it from that perspective, when you take into account the size, the amount of plastic, the molding, all that kind of stuff, and you look at what the value of the dollar is today, you start to realize that $25, while it seems like an insane amount of money compared to probably the $3 that this thing cost back in 1983 or 1984, you start to realize that, well, I mean, honestly, you can see why this thing costs as much as it does, because of the size, the plastic, the molding, the articulation, the separate pieces used to put this thing together. This is just a more complex and expensive figure to manufacture. Just end of story. And I hate to be the one to say that, because I'll be honest with you, when I first started doing research into this, before I even planned on making a video, I was doing research onto this to prove to myself that I was overpaying for action figures. That's why I wanted to make this video, because I wanted to prove that paying $25 for some Marvel Legend or G.I. Joe Classified or whatever it was from Hasbro was too damn much money. And it wasn't worth it. And these figures should be selling for $15 at most. And the more research I did into it, the more I looked up the prices of plastic, the types of plastic used, what moldings cost, all this kind of stuff, I realized that honestly, $25 is not that unreasonable. As much as that sucks for me as a consumer who wants to pay as little as possible for cool stuff, like, unfortunately, I kind of came to the conclusion that while, yeah, maybe the prices could still be hovering at $20 as opposed to $25 and things would probably be okay, still, it's not that bad when it comes right down to it. And again, I hate to be the one to say this because I don't want to acknowledge this myself, that honestly Hasbro and Mattel and McFarlane aren't screwing us as much as I want to think they are, because maybe I just want to be mad because the economy sucks right now and everything just costs more and I'm just kind of tired of it. But when it comes right down to it, I don't really think these companies, McFarlane, Mattel, Hasbro, and so many others, I don't think they are really taking advantage of us like a lot of people think they are. And that is just kind of the truth of the situation. But That's what I got from doing my research. I would love to know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Look, we're all feeling the crunch. And we know over the course of the last year and a half or so, when Hasbro jumped from $20 to $25, we all groaned. We all made a sound. We all felt it in our wallets, and we all hated it. But when you look at inflation, when you look at all these different factors, it really is kind of hard to ignore that it's really not as bad as we think it is. And I would love to know what you guys think. So let me know in the comments section down below what you think about all this. And thank you guys for watching. And as I always say, always remember to enjoy your collection.